Egypt Games, Chapter 4. The Egypt Girls. All through the month of August, Melanie and April were together almost every day. They played the Paper Families game and other games, both in the Ross's apartment and in Caroline's. They took Marshall for walks and to the park while Mrs. Rogers was gone to her class, and almost every day they went to the library. It was in the library in August that the seeds were planted that grew into the Egypt game in September, in the professor's deserted yard. It had all started when April found a new book about Egypt, an especially interesting one about the life of a young pharaoh. She passed it on to Melanie, and with it a lot of her interest in all sorts of ancient stuff. Melanie was soon as fascinated by the valley of the Nile as April had been. Before long, and with the help of the sympathetic librarian, they had found and read just about everything the library had to offer on Egypt, both fact and fiction. They read about Egypt in the library during the day and at home in the evening and in bed late at night when they were supposed to be asleep. Then in the mornings, while they helped each other with the chores, they discussed the things that they had found out. In a very short time, they had accumulated all sorts of fascinating facts about tombs and temples, pharaohs and pyramids, mummies and monarchs, and dozens of other exotic topics. They decided that the Egyptians couldn't have been more interesting if they'd done it on purpose. Everything from their love of beauty and mystery to the fascinating habit of getting married when they were only 11 years old made good stuff to talk about. By the end of the month, April and Melanie were beginning to work on their own alphabet of hieroglyphics for writing secret messages. And at the library, they were beginning to be called the Egypt Girls. But in between all the good times, both April and Melanie were spending some bad moments, worrying about the beginning of school. April was worried because she knew from experience, lots of it, that it isn't easy to face new classes in a new school. She didn't admit it, not even to Melanie, but she was having nightmares about the first day of school. There were classroom nightmares, and school year nightmares, and principal office nightmares, but there was another kind too. That had to do with an empty mailbox. In a whole month of August, she had only one very short postcard from Dorothea. Melanie was worried too, but in a different way. School had always been easy for Melanie, and even though she was the kind of kid who got elected as class president, she'd always had plenty of friends. But now there was April to think about. April was the most exciting friend Melanie had ever had. No one else knew so many fascinating things or could think up such marvelous things to do. With April, a walk to the library could become an exploration of forbidden land, or a shiny pebble on a sidewalk could be a magical token from an invisible power. When April got that imagining gleam in her eye, there was no telling what was going to happen next. Just about any interesting subject you could mention, April was sure to know a lot of weird and wonderful facts about it. And if she didn't, you could always count on her to make up a few, just to keep things going. There was only one thing that April didn't seem to know much about, and that was getting along with people. Most people, anyhow. With Melanie, April was herself, new and different from anyone, wild and daring and terribly brave. But with other people, she was often quite different. With other kids, she usually put on her Hollywood act, terribly grown up and bored with everything. And with most grown-ups, April's eyes got narrowed, and you couldn't believe a word she said. Melanie had gone to Wilson School all her life, and she knew what it was like. There are all different kinds of kids at Wilson, kids who looked and talked and acted all sorts of ways. Wilson was used to that. But there are things that Wilson kids just wouldn't stand for. And Melanie was afraid that April's Hollywood act was one of them. And Melanie wasn't entirely just guessing about how her schoolmates would react to April. A couple of times when April and Melanie had been at the library or in the park, they'd run into some of the Wilson kids Melanie knew. And you could see right away that April wasn't making the right kind of impression. And it was going to be worse at school, where every kid would feel duty-bound to do his or her part in trimming the new kid down to size. Melanie had a feeling that April wasn't going to trim easily. The thing that worried Melanie the most was the eyelashes. April was still wearing them a lot of the time. She'd gotten so she didn't wear them to the library because she still had trouble reading through them. But even if she hadn't had them on all day, she'd always put them on when it was time for her grandmother to come home. Once Melanie asked her why. She doesn't like them for me to wear them, April said. Melanie thought about that for a minute. Then she said, "You don't like your grandmother very much, do you?" April just shrugged, but her eyes got narrow. "I don't see why," Melanie said. "She seems pretty nice to me." "Well, she doesn't like my mother," April said. "She doesn't even think that Dorothea is going to send for me to come home pretty soon." "Did she say so?" "No, but she still thinks it. I can tell." Then, just at the beginning of September, with school only a few days away, came that exciting day when the Egypt game began. April and Melanie and Marshall were all on their way home, going through the alley, when, by the sheerest of luck, Melanie noticed the loose plank. It had moved stiffly that first time, with a reluctant rusty yelp, and they peeked through it into the hidden and deserted yard. It was fascinating, so weed-grown and forgotten and secret. But then came the most unbelievably wonderful part of it all. There she was, waiting for them in the shed, Nefertiti, the beautiful queen of ancient Egypt, like a magical omen, or as April put it, a beautiful message from out of the ancient past. There had to be something terribly out of the ordinary about it. Why, it had only been a few days before that they had even read aloud all about her and admired a picture of her lovely sculptured head. And there it was, almost like magic, very much like magic, in fact. And that's the way the Egypt game was, from the beginning. But even the discovery of Egypt didn't stop the beginning of school from arriving, with all of its problems. So when April lost one of her eyelashes that first day in Egypt, Melanie couldn't help feeling a little relieved, although she wouldn't have said so. But then, there it was on security, and the problem was just as complicated as ever. It was the next morning when Melanie finally got up enough nerve to talk about it to April. April was helping Melanie dry the dishes so they'd be ready to leave for Egypt sooner. "Are you going to wear your eyelashes to school?" Melanie asked with careful casualness. But April turned quickly, and with her face all shut up from the way it was with other people. "Sure," she said. "Why not?" "Oh, I don't know. I just don't think anybody else at Wilson wears them." April's chin went up and her lips thinned. "Am I supposed to care what the kids at the little old place like Wilson School wears?" Melanie could see that she wasn't going to get anywhere, so she let the subject drop. But before the dishes were finished, she had started making a drastic plan. April just couldn't wear those eyelashes to school on the first day. She was going to be hard enough to integrate even without them. As soon as Melanie had finished her chores, they were free to head for Egypt. Since it was Saturday, Melanie's parents were both home. But Mr. Ross always had to study, and he was only too glad for the girls to get Marshall out from underfoot. Just outside the apartment door, April stopped, with her fingers to her lips. "Shh," she warned. "We must proceed with caution. We may be watched." "Who's watching?" Marshall asked, looking around. "The enemies of Egypt." "Who were those worst enemies, Melanie?" "The sirens," Melanie whispered. "Yeah, they're the ones. The sirens. Their spies are everywhere." With an elaborate caution, they made their way out of the back door of Casa Rosada and down the alley. They went the wrong way first and took evasive action through a garage and around a stack of garbage pails. Then they crawled through a piece of cement pipe and started to make a run for it. But they had to go back for Marshall, who was still in the pipe, all tangled up in security's legs. When they finally arrived at the fence, they were out of breath. "All clear?" Melanie asked, looking both ways. "Yes, for the time being," April breathed. But they almost had us. That was a close call back in there in the tunnel. Close, Melanie agreed, but we fooled them. With that, they shoved Marshall through the hole in the fence and crawled in after him.